Now that we have the factory and we can have access to the Antelope facade, we could create a controller in order to test if the facade returns the data that we're expecting. Let's create a controller, and for that we're going to create here a folder, controller, and then in order to test the endpoint we need to create a resource controller. Let's just right click on the folder Antelopes BackendApi, and we're going to create a new class, and we're going to call it AntelopesResourceController. Okay, we're talking about the Antelopes API, so we just call it Antelopes, okay, in plural, and then resource controller. And we're going to extend the AbstractController from Spryker Glue Kernel Backend Controller. And the first method that we're going to define is going to be the method to return a collection of antelopes. In this case, we implement by naming convention the method get and then collection and the postfix action so that we can map this method to an endpoint. And this method is going to return a GlueResourceTransfer. So we already have access to this DTO from the core. If we take a look inside GlueResourceTransfer, you can see here the properties that we have in this object. We have the content, we have the access to the pagination, HTTP status, we can set the errors, meta, the resources we would like to add to this response, the status, and you can see some other fields like filters, sortings, format. So we already have access to this DTO, and we also have access to the GlueResourceTransfer. If we just type hint here, GlueResourceTransfer, when this endpoint is going to be called, then we're going to have access to the response here. Also, as we're extending from the AbstractController, we have access to the getFactory method here. So we can type hint the method getFactory to be pointing to our factory and not to the default one. So our factory is inside pyz glue Antelopes BackendApi Antelopes Backend Factory. So we can type hint this method here so that we have access to our factory. In this case, if we just type this getFactory, and you can see that we can have access to the methods that we design inside that factory. In this case, getAntelopeFacade, and then we can call, for example, getAntelopeCollection. And as you can see, we have to define an AntelopeCriteriaTransfer. So we can just initialize this value with new AntelopeCriteriaTransfer. We're not going to be passing any data inside the criteria transfer so that we have access to all of the antelopes, but remember that we have to return a GlueResourceTransfer. So for testing purposes, let's just create this GlueResourceTransfer, and you can see that if we just type response transfer, we have the possibility to add resource. And inside this add resource method, we have to pass a resource. Okay, so we can just initialize this element here with new GlueResourceTransfer, and then we can add the values that we need to this resource. For example, we can add the type, and in this case we would add the type that is antelopes, so we can have access to antelopes backend config and then antelopes to have this constant. Then we can add resource set attributes, and we have to pass the attributes from our antelope. But we don't have any DTO to represent the attributes that we want to return in this getCollectionAction. Okay, so we have to call this method with the attributes that we want to pass here. And of course, when we call getAntelopeCollection, here we would have our antelopes. And you can see that it would be an AntelopeCollectionTransfer. It means that we have to populate this response transfer for every antelope that we receive here. So it means that we would have to just loop through this array of antelopes, and then we would create a resource for every antelope, and then we would add that resource to the response transfer. So everything that we have here has to be inside the for each except for the GlueResourceTransfer. Then we would get here the antelope, and in here, in order to have the antelopes, we have here, if you can see, we return an antelope collection, okay? But in order to get the antelopes, we have to call getAntelopes. And in this case, we would have an array of antelope transfer. It means that now here we can just call antelope to array. Of course, we're going to create a DTO and we're going to populate that DTO. And here, after we finish from this for each, we just return the response transfer. Let's create the DTO for defining the properties that we want to return as attributes, because maybe there are some properties that we don't want to return from the antelope. If you remember here in the PYZ shared, we have antelope, and here we define the antelope location, antelope collection. You can see that we have antelopes. That's why we called getAntelopes. We have everything related to the pagination, even though we already have also this DTO from the core. And here you can see that we have the antelope, and we could just call the AntelopeTransfer if we wanted to just return all of the properties. But we're going to create a dedicated DTO for the Backend API. In this case, we're going to create a new folder here inside the shared folder for the Antelopes Backend API. So let's right click and let's create a folder, Antelopes Backend API, and let's create also here a DTO definition. And for that, let's create the name of the file, and the name of the file, the XML file, would be the snake case of the name. So antelopes_backend_API.transfer.xml. So we can take the heading from this file, from the Antelope transfer, and inside here we're going to define the DTO that we need to return as a GlueResponseTransfer. So first we have to define a transfer object for the attributes. So the naming convention would be, and let's create the transfer, it would be Antelopes Backend API, because that's the name of the module, and then we add the postfix attributes. Then we add a strict true, and then inside we define all of the properties that we would like to return. And for the time being, it's going to be very similar to the ones that we have here, so we can copy and paste from this transfer the properties that we want to return. And here we have to move this file inside the transfer folder, otherwise it's not going to be found. Let's execute the code again, and let's create an instance of that DTO. So Antelopes Backend API attributes transfer, and then we can populate that DTO by calling from array, and we pass the antelope to array. And then we can add here we pass true to ignore the missing properties. Then at this point we can add the attributes to the resource, and we have to set also here to the resource the ID of the resource, because we're going to have a list of antelopes, and we can do it here with resource ID, and then we can call antelope get id antelope. We're going to be extracting this piece of code into a response builder, but just for testing the controller, we're going to leave it here for the time being. And here is set. And as you can see here, the set ID expects null or string, so we have to cast our ID to string, and we can just concatenate the empty string so that we can cast it into string. All right, now that we have this controller, we can test this get collection, but we still need to register this resource, and we still need to declare the methods that we're going to respond to with this resource controller.